What I want to give you here is a way to interrupt a stuck decision process. Instead of just persuading people, I want to help you change the structure that their thinking is running on. And this idea is coming from an unexpected place. I want to start with a meeting I recognize immediately. Let's say in a software company. It's a roadmap review where one dependency keeps blocking release. The feature slipped last quarter, the explanation improved, and the decision stayed the same. In manufacturing, it's an operations call about yield drift. I've watched the charts get rebuilt. I've heard the variance explained cleanly. The line still underperforms. Variance here means how much results are changing or fluctuating, and underperforming means it produces worse results than expected. In a consultancy, it's a post-engagement review after a lost client. Everyone agrees on what happened. The narrative holds together. The corrective actions resemble the last set. And none of these meetings feel careless. People prepare, people pay attention, people sound competent, and everybody's accountable. If you recognize this pattern, that recognition is already useful. It means the problem is diagnosable, meaning you can clearly identify what's going wrong. It also means it can be interrupted. And what stands out to me is the repetition. I've been in these rooms as the person running the meeting and as the person expected to explain why the next iteration would finally work. And the pattern holds across industries and roles. The explanations get better, the slides get cleaner, the logic becomes easier to defend when I'm asked to report to the people above me, but the decision output doesn't change. Most organizations explain this as an execution problem. Sometimes it's framed as a misalignment, meaning people or teams are not aiming at the same goal. Other times it's treated as incentives or a communication problem. I think something more specific is happening. Leadership failures often persist because teams keep reasoning inside the same mental track, a habitual way of thinking about a problem. And correction requires introducing competing structure, not more discussion. And by competing structure, I mean a new setup that forces thinking in a different way. This claim will become concrete once you look at how these meetings actually operate. The group shares one dominant representation of the problem, meaning the shared way the problem is pictured or explained. The same metrics define what counts as evidence. And by metrics here, I mean numbers or measurements used to judge performance. The same causal story organizes the interpretation. As long as that representation stays in place, new information gets absorbed. And at that point, this is what's interesting. Certain things stop happening. No one proposes a structurally different alternative. No one suggests changing the lens that defines success. No one introduces a constraint that would force a different trade-off, like a limit or a restriction that removes options. What replaces search is refinement, meaning you make something more detailed without changing its core principles. People will add detail, they'll clarify assumptions, they'll strengthen justifications for choices they've made. The shared model becomes internally consistent, meaning the explanation fits together logically. And from the outside, this looks like progress. From the inside, it feels responsible. The next decision, unfortunately, stays the same. I didn't arrive at this idea through management theory first. I backed into it from a psychology paper that initially struck me as unrelated to leadership. The paper examined intrusive mental replay after traumatic events, like unwanted memories that pop into the back of your mind after an emotionally overwhelming or distressing event. The researchers in this paper were not asking whether people healed or felt better. They were asking why certain visual memories kept returning without intention. Their outcome measure was narrow. They counted how often intrusive images appeared over the following week after being shown these things. The participants were shown distressing visual material. Shortly afterwards, some of them played Tetris for a short period. Others completed tasks involving writing or verbal reasoning for the same amount of time. And the comparison here isolates the effect to the type of mental work being done, rather than time spent, effort expended, or distractions alone. Time was controlled, attention was controlled, and the contact that the participants had with the experimenter was also controlled. The difference showed up in one place. People who played Tetris reported fewer spontaneous visual replays over the next several days. People who performed verbal tasks generally did not. Now, in some cases, verbal tasks coincided with more of that unwanted replay. Other measures moved very little. The mood did not broadly improve and beliefs about the event did not change. The memory could still be recalled deliberately when participants chose to think about it, but they had to choose to think about it. What did change was the frequency of how often those unwanted memories or visions occurred. I read that result as an interference effect rather than a corrective one. Interference meaning one mental process blocks the other. Visuospatial working memory has limited capacity. And by visuospatial working memory, I mean the brain's short-term space for visual and spatial thinking. Playing Tetris continuously occupies the systems responsible for spatial prediction, rotation, and placement, which is basically you anticipating where objects will go in space. During that window, those same cognitive resources are less available to stabilize and rehearse visual imagery from the event. Replay becomes less likely because the imagery cannot consolidate in the brain the same way as it would if these resources weren't otherwise occupied. The two features of this finding stood out to me. First, the effect depended on the type of mental process involved. Tasks that relied on language and verbal reasoning did not compete with visual imagery in the same way that spatial tasks did. Second, the effect was temporary. The frequency reduction faded over time, but the memory wasn't erased. Those limits make the result more useful, not less. They show exactly what interference can and can't do, and this maps cleanly onto how organizations or teams get stuck. Teams fixate when one way of thinking about the problem becomes dominant. A narrative becomes the only way the problem is described. A dashboard becomes the only way performance is interpreted and discussed, and alternative descriptions lose access to the conversation. Now, at that point, adding more discussion rarely helps. The discussion draws on the same mental resources. It increases coherence inside the existing model, meaning how well the explanation fits together. It does not increase the probability that the model gets replaced with a more successful one. From a cognitive perspective, this reflects capacity limits rather than resistance. Working memory doesn't expand with effort, it reallocates, meaning it shifts attention from one thing to another. Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman helped me put language to what I was observing here. Much of his career focused on why skilled professionals make predictable errors even when incentives are clear and stakes are high. The problem persisted under conditions where motivation was not in question. In Thinking Fast and Slow, he treats attention as a limited resource. Tasks interfere when they draw on overlapping cognitive capacity. Effort redistributes attention, not increase it. I took from that a warning about overvaluing deliberation or careful extended thinking. A team can think harder and still fail to update to a more successful model, especially after a failure. Deliberation can increase internal consistency without increasing adaptability. Kahneman does not argue that slow reasoning reliably corrects these limits. Deliberation still consumes bandwidth or available mental capacity. When one framing dominates, additional reasoning often deepens commitment to it. The Tetris paper demonstrates that same constraint experimentally, uh, where they tested that in a controlled study. Filling a cognitive channel alters what can stabilize inside of it. Now, in his book, Sources of Power: How People Make Decisions by Gary Klein, Gary Klein's work helped me to understand why this dynamic is especially strong in experienced teams. Klein studied experts operating under pressure. He focused on people who were exceptionally skilled and at the top of their fields. What he found was that experts rarely compare multiple options. They recognize patterns and act. Recognition compresses search. They shorten the time they spend considering alternatives. That skill produces speed and competence. However, I am arguing that it also introduces a vulnerability. Once a situation looks familiar enough, the system commits, meaning everybody locks into a choice. When the first workable pattern is slightly wrong, experts tend to persist. They adjust details, reinterpret signals. They stay inside the same pattern that they know works. Klein documents cases where experienced leaders continued applying a familiar model even as conditions shifted. The behavior looked disciplined, however, a failure was more and more likely, or the outcome deteriorated. I see this pattern in organizations that I've been a part of. Past success sharpens recognition. Recognition accelerates commitment. Commitment narrows representational space or the range of ways the problem can be thought about. And like I mentioned earlier, search declines. At that stage, asking for better analysis often reinforces the dominant pattern. The system is already optimized to explain itself. Klein's work helped me see why interruption feels uncomfortable. When recognition is disrupted, the fluency or ease of speaking or thinking drops. People speak more slowly, their confidence declines, and the first answer stops sounding obviously correct. I've watched leaders misread that moment as confusion or incompetence. The Tetris studies suggest another interpretation. As long as the visual spatial channel is occupied, certain imagery patterns or maladaptive thought patterns can't reassert themselves. The system is forced into a different allocation of attention. The effect lasts only while the structure remains in place. Once the task ends, replay can return. That boundary is the difference between a temporary shift in what the team can consider and a permanent change in what the team believes. Structural interventions in organizations behave the same way, meaning you're changing or making changes to the setup or the rules. You're not changing arguments. Here is one concrete example. I've watched teams replace a recurring debate with a requirement to build a small prototype before the next meeting. No slides, no narrative defense. The only input allowed is something that exists physically and can be inspected. The discussion changes immediately. Some arguments disappeared because they cannot be expressed without the tangible object or output, and other disagreements surface because constraints are now visible. Nothing about the team's beliefs has changed. Only the structure has. When meetings return to the same agenda, the same dashboard, and the same incentives, the earlier narrative regains control of the discussion. Interference alters dynamics while present. It does not permanently rewrite beliefs. This explains why some changes feel effective without feeling insightful. A prototype replaces a debate. A constraint removes degrees of freedom. A deadline reshapes workflow. A format change alters how people prepare. The system thinks differently, and the people inside of it think differently because they have to. I've seen these moments arrive unintentionally. A supply disruption forces a redesign. A staffing change alters reporting flow. A client demand invalidates the existing plan because it's no longer workable or it doesn't make any more sense. And everybody gets back to work. Progress resumes. The explanation arrives later. The mistake is attributing improvement to clarity rather than restructuring the problem posed to the team. And in leadership, in this frame, involves recognizing when reasoning has become self-reinforcing, meaning there's a feedback loop or everyone is feeding back into themselves and they're reaching the same less than optimal outcome. The intervention shifts the channel that cognition uses. It doesn't argue the system into change. Tetris earns its place here because it isolates that mechanism without interpretation. In Tetris, there's no persuasion, there's no motivation, there's just continual mental effort. Once I noticed that, I started seeing the same signal in organizational settings. Everyone can explain the situation clearly, the decision output stays unchanged week to week. At that point, additional explanation often increases agreement without increasing movement. And changing the structure changes what cognition can access. That is the point of everything I've discussed here. So ultimately, when a team keeps reaching the same failure, the problem is rarely effort or clarity. It's that the structure that leadership has provided hasn't changed. And until that structure changes, the outcome usually won't. If this framework is useful, I'm continuing the discussion in the Discord. That's where people are pressure testing these ideas and suggesting cases worth analyzing next. And if you've seen this kind of failure loop play out somewhere else, I'd like to hear about it in the comments.